Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. We are pleased to present Bill Kennedy as he walks us through EPA's latest modifications to the steam electric generation effluent limitations and guidelines. I am Heather Dean, your hostess. During this meeting, you will be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. If you're joining via computer or your mobile device, you can do so by selecting the Q&A icon in the top panel of your screen. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. And with that, Bill, I will kick it over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you, Heather, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in today. EPA blessed us once again with a revision to the steam electric ELGs. And this seems like we've been doing these presentations almost on a perennial basis here. So this is me, my smiling face here. I think I know many of y'all. I've been around the industry for a number of years. I'm a recovering electric power utility employee, and have spent quite a bit of time working with the various waste streams that we're going to talk today. But with anything that we do here at Stantec, we always start off with a safety moment. And as we are getting into the summer months, we just had Memorial Day and the long holiday weekend. Sun safety is something that we all need to keep in mind. Yeah. First of all, anything that we can do to minimize our overall exposure, making sure we keep our skin safe, will be helpful. Obviously, the middle of the day and with daylight savings time, that's anywhere between about 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. is where we have the maximum sun exposure. Rule of thumb is when the sun is where your shadow is the shortest, that's where you're getting the most exposure during that time of day. Stay in the shade where you can, long sleeve clothing, to cover up exposed skin. I've learned over the years as I've become follically challenged that wearing a hat's a good idea also. Sunglasses with appropriate UV protection and sunscreen, especially as we're perspiring or if we're out having fun, might be around a pool, might be around a lake or the ocean. Make sure you're reapplying every couple hours there, even on those cloudy days. So as we get into the rule here, the effluent limitation guidelines and standards for the steam electric power generating point source category, 40 CFR part 423, and I bring out the full title and the reference to the Federal Register, because as you're looking up the rule, that's really what you're going to have to type into Google to see the complete rule. EPA updated flue gas desulfurization wastewater, FGD. They updated the bottom ash transport water category. Leachate, they did some things with leachate a little bit more specific. Leachate was remanded back off of the 2015 rule. And then EPA got into legacy wastewaters in much more detail than they previously had. And actually legacy wastewaters, which we'll talk about, is more of a catch-all. Our attorneys here wanted to make sure we have this little statement at the bottom. Following is a technical overview of the ELGs and is not intended to be comprehensive or provide legal interpretation, advice, or site-specific regulatory guidance. And that last part, site-specific, most of these opportunities here with the rule will be very dependent on your site, on your on which jurisdiction you're in. As with any good federal regulation, there are lots of acronyms here. We're not covering them all on this glossary sheet, but some of the more common ones for your reference: BAT, BATW, BPJ. We have a new one coming up in the rule, which is combustion residual leachate. The other one here that is new with this round is what I'll refer to as FED, functional equivalent of direct discharges. POTW, PSES, pretreatment standards for existing sources. So starting out with FGD. What is FGD wastewater? Well, EPA clearly defined it in a handful of definitions here. It is the blowdown from our scrubber systems. It is any sort of over or underflow from the solid separation process. That's the gypsum separation process for those that are actually making saleable gypsum. It's the wash water off that gypsum, and it's any sort of filtrate that comes from the dewatering system. Those haven't changed since the last revision of the rule. And along with that, what is not, these are the exceptions. Cleaning water from the scrubbers, from solid separation dewatering equipment, cleaning water from any sort of paste transportation piping. And that's a little bit of an illusion that EPA is good with pasting, sequestration, encapsulation processes. Any sort of floor drains that are in the FGD process area. Treated FGD wastewater permeate or distillate that's sent back for boiler and makeup water. Those are all excluded. And now we have a new definition that was incorporated in this year's revision, is decommissioning flows and any sort of 10-year, 24-hour storm event stormwaters that are coming in here. Those are not considered FGD wastewaters. So as we're going through this, it's pretty straightforward. Just about all the rules for the general interpretation or the general application of them are no discharge. Now, as with any good federal rule, there are lots of exceptions in here and lots of qualifiers. So first of all, there's no discharge of FGD wastewater following 12/31 of 2029. That is a no later than date. You'd need to comply with the 2020 ELGs. So whatever category you're in, if you're in the general BAT category, that means you need to have your treatment system up and running by no later than 12/31 of 25. There are all kinds of dates that I'm going to refer to here, and you just really need to keep up with the calendar and the schedule, but you're going to hear some reoccurring themes. The compliance with the 12/31/25 date, the 12/31/29 date in here, those are pretty consistent across them all. These are all the no later than dates. Your individual permits could be more aggressive with earlier compliance dates. Any sort of permeate and distillate that's generated from a no discharge FGD wastewater treatment system may be reused in FGD, going back to the scrubber itself, going back using as cleaning water for the mist eliminators, or it can be used to source water back to your boiler makeup water system. You need to provide your permit writers with justification for the as soon as possible date, which could be as early as 6 weeks from now, 7/8 of 24. So soon as possible is just a few weeks away, but hopefully you'll have the opportunity to work with your permit writers on your next revision. But keep in mind that many of y'all have NPDES permits that have been administratively continued for a number of years, some of you even for decades now. And a lot of the states have been waiting for EPA to finally come up with what the rule is before they start trying to invest resources here. I mentioned here on the no discharge of FGD wastewater, that discharge of permeate, which was going back to the scrubber, back to the boiler, you may be able to get an extension if you request it, but it needs to be in your permit. And I can't emphasize enough this last bullet here: communicate with your permit writers as soon as possible to make sure that they know what your needs are, what your capabilities are, and what your schedule requirements are. That's a reoccurring theme here. As you concentrate, your deep well injection falls under RCRA, and that could, depending on how far you concentrate it, could then be a hazardous solution. So you need to take a holistic approach to compliance. Many folks have stated, sure, we can concentrate your water, we can give you a zero discharge system. But remember mass balances. We're in the fossil industry. We don't make matter, we don't destroy matter, we just move it from one place to another. So along with the generally applicable category, EPA has maintained the subcategories off of the 2020 rule. The voluntary incentive plan is still out there. One of the caveats of the voluntary incentive plan is that if you meet the requirements of the VIP, there are no future no discharge requirements. It's very interesting, but at the same time, if you look at what these requirements are for arsenic, mercury, selenium, nitrite, nitrate, bromides, and TDS, these are very, very stringent. For the most part, all of these are much, much tighter than drinking water requirements, and bromide and TDS discharges are relatively challenging on top of the rest of them. Really need to look if you're going to all the energy and time and effort to achieve these minimal discharge requirements for VIP, if it makes more sense just to go ahead to go to ZLD without having the compliance risk on the table. But all the deadlines of the 2020 ELGs still apply here. If you're retiring your units by 2028, that option still applies as long as you have hit all the dates that were in the 2020 rule, letting your state know about it. For the low generation units and the high flow subcategories, those are still out there. The timeframes that were allowed for those still apply, but then after those times expired, you still have to have that in your permit, which once again, the reoccurring dates are July 8th of this year and no later than 12/31/29. As far as EPA is referenced, only 2 utilities ever applied, or 2 sites ever applied for the low generating utilization subcategory, and the 1 site that qualified for the high flow subcategory has announced retirement of that site. So this last bullet here may be relatively moot. There is a new retirement subcategory for FGD that for those sites that retire by the end of 2034, you may continue with the 2020 ELGs. If you're in compliance with the 2020 rule in your permit, if you filed a notice of planned participation by the end of 25, and if you're retiring by the end of 34, you may continue to discharge for up to 120 days to allow for decommissioning clean out of the units. If you do not retire by 12/31/34 for whatever reasons that have occurred, you may not discharge after that 12/31 date. There is no shutdown exceptions or exemptions allowed in there. Bottom ash transport water. First of all, what is it? Well, this is the water that is used to convey bottom ash or economizer ash from the ash collection or storage equipment or boiler, and it is direct contact with the ash. any sort of wastewaters or stormwaters that are commingled with bottom ash transport water are then categorized as bottom transport water. Quench water that is not used to transport is not bottom ash transport water. Even though it may essentially be practically the same water, quench water is exempt from the definition of BATW. So similar to FGD, you need to comply with the 2020 ELGs and then no discharge of bottom ash transport water. The same as soon as date of July 8th of this year, and the same no later than date as New Year's Eve of 29. Bottom ash transport water during this time frame where we are no discharge may be used for FGD makeup water. Now, this is contrary to other categories. Permeate and distillate is not allowed for reuse in boiler makeup water. And this is interesting why EPA may have made this difference. FGD and combustion residual leachate categories do allow reuse in your boiler makeup water. It may be an oversight on their part, certainly something, if it's of interest, you may want to have your environmental attorneys challenge this. The subcategories, the retirement of units by 28 is still allowed if you met the notice of planned participation deadline that's in the 2020 rules. The low generation utilization is still allowed out there, as it is with FGD, but then you have to comply with the 2024 dates. Found it interesting. I found this little graphic here, EPA offering early retirement. That headline was referring to their employees, not our units. They put in a new retirement subcategory for bottom ash. Same date, retire by 12/31/34. If you're meeting the 2020 rules in the permit, if you file that notice of planned participation by the end of 25, if you are retiring by the end of 34, they give you the same 120 days to clean out your systems for decommissioning. And then similar again, if you're not retired by 12/31 of 34, no discharge whatsoever is allowed. Now, when I say no discharge whatsoever, EPA did put in caveats for must run, which I'll touch on later on, that may be coming from DOE, may come from your state regulatory or state utility commissions or whatnot. That's the proverbial get out of jail free card. Combustion residual leachate. Once again, EPA continued with the definition that they added into the 2015 rule as a result of some comments from industry that we needed to have a very specific definition. So leachate is liquid, including suspended and dissolved constituents in that liquid that have percolated through are the key words here. Materials that are placed in a landfill or that passes through the surface impoundment containment structure. So it needs to go through or come out of a landfill. This includes seepage and or leakage from a combustion residual landfill or impoundment. And this is straight out of the regs, so I apologize for reading, but I just wanted to make sure that we get the wording right out of the rules. Leachate includes wastewater from landfills and surface impoundments located on non-adjoining property when under the operation control of the permitted facility. This definition here is different than what's in the CCR rule. So these are two different rules that have not necessarily been coordinated. Make sure you're reading them all and aware of them, going back to that holistic compliance. So prior revisions of the ELGs categorized leachate as a low volume waste stream. That included having limits for suspended solids, oil and grease, and then if you were doing a direct discharge for pH. These limits still apply. The 24 revision here created some additional classifications or multiple classifications, I should say, for combustion residual leachate. So the first generally applicable category, very similar to the other two that we've already discussed, no discharge while the units are still generating. EPA appeared to exclude contact stormwater from this zero discharge definition. And as I mentioned, it allows permeate and distillate reuse in FGD and boiler makeup water. However, when I say it allows, this was mentioned in the preamble, but it was not actually put into the rule itself. Once again, this is an area where you're going to need guidance. Preamble and the technical development documents generally are used to reference what EPA's intent is. However, it's much more straightforward if EPA actually put it in the rule. Was this an oversight, or did EPA have some sort of ulterior motive here? So while units are still generating, the applicability dates, once again, we have our July of this year date and a no later than date of the end of 29. And then there's also the opportunity, if you request it, you can discharge permeate after the units are shut down for an additional year to allow you to continue to process that material. After the units have been retired, discharge is then allowed. And these are the familiar limits from the voluntary incentive plan for FGD. Those same very low limits for these multiple constituents here. Not real clear why we go from no discharge to an allowable discharge. It's an opportunity to process the water. These limits are very low. My sense is it appears to be contrary to the anti-backsliding logic that EPA has applied over the years to other waste streams. I wouldn't necessarily challenge this, but wouldn't be surprised if the environmental groups that are out there will challenge this. So be aware, keep informed on what the litigation is. There's the retirement subcategory. Once again, if you permanently cease coal combustion by the end of 34 and you file a notice of planned participation by the end of 25, familiar dates, they're phys-chem based limits or technology based limits for arsenic and mercury, both of which are relatively generous. Keep in mind, based on analytical turnaround, monthly averages are what you want to design treatment systems to, not daily maximums. EPA put a new category out of unmanaged combustion residual leachate. So what is this? Unmanaged leachate is defined as those discharges determined to be the functional equivalent of a direct discharge to waters of the U.S. through groundwater. This is a direct result of the Maui County court ruling that came out a couple years ago. Or waters that have leached from a waste management unit into the subsurface and mixed with groundwater before being captured and pumped to the surface for discharge to waters of the U.S. Same limits here, but what EPA did was essentially wrap their arms around any potential transport of water through groundwater that may eventually make it to surface waters. As I mentioned, same limits for arsenic and mercury here. The applicability dates as soon as 24, no later than 29, are still in here. However, EPA is also requiring annual monitoring reports to go along with these feds. Monitoring well location descriptions, summary statistics of analysis, all the data that was included in the appendix of the rule, description of facilities that the permitting authority determines are feds, groundwater monitoring data as it leaves the disposal unit, groundwater monitoring data where the leachate enters the surface water body. Interesting here that EPA had been had part of the 2015 rule remanded because they were using the ELGs for a data collection program, which the courts told them that is not what the ELGs are for. It's going to be interesting to see where this ends up, because the list of statistics that they're looking for is monitoring for antimony to zinc. Yeah, this 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 different constituents. This appears to be outside of EPA's authority under the Clean Water Act, as it's dealing directly with groundwater, and it also seems to be contrary to the previous court rulings. I would anticipate this is going to get challenged. Nevertheless, these are currently the rules, and these are the rules that we all need to comply with. So as we're dealing with combustion residual leachate, there's some challenges here. Leachate treatment may continue for years after the plant shut down. As a general rule, 30 years post-closure requirements. Treatment needs may vary over time, both in quantity of water treated and constituent makeup. There may be multiple combustion residual leachate locations at a site. So are you going to look at putting in multiple treatment systems? Or are you going to be able to combine them into a single treatment system? There are advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. And keep in mind also that our impoundments are far from being homogeneous. For those of you that have been around these impoundments over the decades, they could contain fly ash, bottom ash, boiler slag, gypsum. Hey, we used to clear out our intake structures when they'd get clogged up in the river, and so the silt, the dredgings that came from the river, any number of materials have ended up in these landfills. And so depending on where in the landfill or the impoundment, excuse me, that something may be being removed, something may be exposed to air, or if it's been encapsulated, there is an opportunity for this leachate to change over time. As with anything, as we're dealing with these remote locations, keep safety in mind. Being remote, and if the basis or the best available technology, these physical chemical treatment systems, they involve chemicals. So what are we going to do for eye wash, showers, spill containment on these remote locations? What happens if somebody gets hurt? Are we going to have one person out there by themselves? Remember, we're shutting some of these coal plants down. We're not going to have a control room at some of these sites. So what happens? How are we going to staff these? Are there going to be the technicians that are maintaining our solar panels? Are they the ones that are going to look at these leachate treatment systems? Are we going to have rotating staff among multiple stations? We're going to do contract operations. All things to consider, but at the end of the day, these are all considerations that first and foremost should consider safety. So as we deal with the last of the categories here, legacy wastewater. Legacy wastewaters are not defined per se in the rule. They're only described and defined in the preamble. And these are waters that are subject to the ELGs before the ELG applicability date in the permit. Sounds confusing. As an example, leachate remaining in an impoundment after the ELG applicability date. So you may have had bottom ash sluice water going out to your impoundment for years. You stop sluicing that water. So is the water in the impoundment, is that bottom ash water, transport water? Is it leachate? Is it FGD purge water? In order to make it much cleaner, neater for dewatering and retirement of these impoundments, EPA has said, look, these are legacy waters and we will treat them separately. Additional, as they're being treated separately, limits for these legacy waters will have to be determined by best professional judgment to determine what best available technology is. This process, which is done by the local authorities, your state regulatory authorities, matches very much to what EPA had to go to develop these ELGs. What are the constituents of concern? What are the treatment technology, associated costs, both capital and operating? What's the removal efficiency? What are the non-water environmental impacts potentially here? It's a rigorous process. It's a time-consuming process that the state agencies typically are not staffed or have the resources to address. This is where the utilities, you're going to have to work with your regulators. Other provisions within the rule, CCR impoundment closures. I mentioned earlier, there is a crossover here. So impoundment closures per the CCR rule, there's an effective date of July 8th of this year where the waters coming out of those enclosures meet the same phys-chem, arsenic, and mercury limits as the leachate rule. Decommissioning flows. Referred to this earlier also. Flows within 120 days of shutdown are excluded in the definitions of FGD and bottom ash transport water for end-of-life equipment. Gives us some time to decommission the sites, get rid of that last water. There are pre-treatment standards in the rule also for existing sources. That's a way of referring to any potential discharge to a POTW, your local sewer plant. The ELGs for the pre-treatment standards have the same requirements for the various waste streams here as they do if you're having a direct discharge to surface waters, except for the applicability dates are much earlier, 3 years from publication of the rule, May 9th, 2027. And once again, all these need to be coordinated with your permit writers. High intensity storm exemption for FGD, bottom ash, and leachate excludes any discharges that are necessary as a result of a high intensity infrequent storm greater than a 10-year, 24-hour event. Those discharges would not be subject to the zero discharge requirements, but rather to the low volume waste criteria. And that's the TSS, oil and grease, and pH. However, in order to have this exemption, there needs to be a report prepared and by a professional engineer and submitted to the regulatory agencies on why this discharge was necessary and why you didn't have the capabilities in documenting the storm events and what the capabilities and capacities of your system are. So while there is an exclusion, it is relatively rigorous here. Along with everything else, there is a compliance website. As with the CCR rule, you have to put together a website. You can combine it with your CCR website and just put multiple pages on there. It must be available to the general public to download those documents without having to register, or comes down to identifying who those individuals are. And the website must be kept up to date. There are strict deadlines on this website, schedule compliance. So the first is anything that you submit to your regulator has to be posted on the website within 30 days. Any compliance documents that are submitted before July of 24, July 8th of 24, must be posted by July 8th of 24. So if your organizations are anything like the ones that I've worked with in the past, you have an IT department, you have your environmental department, you have your legal department, all of which have to work together to develop the website and to make sure that the postings are appropriate. You really want to start this dialogue and the website development process now. And keeping in mind anything that you submit to the regulatory authorities before that July 8th date has to be up on the site by July 8th. If you have a choice in the matter, I would suggest holding off until July 9th and submitting anything, but there may be site-specific requirements there that preclude that option. Permit conditions. All these ELGs are implemented through your NPDES permits. Technically, the ELGs apply to the permit writers. These are the consideration that the permit writers have to apply when they're putting your permits together. Begin those conversations with your permit writers as soon as possible when you're talking about applicability dates. Let them know what your plans for retirement are. How long do you need your sites to be running? What equipment are you installing to treat these various systems? The allowable applicability dates factors into the rule. So make sure you don't have a permit writer that's just waiting for this rule to come out and gives you a July 8th date here just because they can fill in the blanks. Communicate, and if possible, even collaborate working together. Request severability and a permit reopener clause in your permit. If those are not in there, you will not necessarily be able to benefit of the litigation that is inevitable. A number of states have already lined up to challenge the rules. Industry groups have already lined up, and I'm sure individual utilities are reviewing with in-house counsel what is appropriate to support your needs. And I mentioned this or alluded to this earlier, make sure your permits include must-run language if you have a retirement exemption that you're going after. This must-run language is, hey, we couldn't get the combined cycle plant up and running soon enough. If we retire the plant by this date, we're going to have reliability issues on the grid. If you can get DOE, BPJ, your regional authorities, your state utility commissions to give you a must-run order to keep your plant open, that's that get out of jail free card that I referred. But that language needs to be in your permit. And we had these webinars in 23. We had it again back in 20. And Lindy and I have been working on this together since 07. I've worked with many of you over the years, commenting and strategizing through EPRI, through UAG, and other collaborations. This is not the end of the rule. Read the rule, read the preamble, read the technical development document. Those all go to EPA's intent. Expect legal challenges. The courts could remand something, but unless there's a stay to a portion of the rule, the clock keeps on ticking. So keep in mind, or stay aware of what's going on. The greenhouse gas rule retirement dates are not coordinated with the ELG retirement dates. You need to be aware of the functional impact and the strategic impact of both of these rules. So be aware. Read the whole rule, not just the revisions. What came out earlier this month is essentially an errata document. As we get into the last 46 pages of the rule or so, it says, hey, add this paragraph, replace this paragraph with the other. Go online, pull up 40 CFR 423 and read the rule in its entirety, or at least have that entire document available for reference. I found that Cornell Law has an outstanding website that's very easy to download, search, and utilize, a little bit better than the federal websites. So at this point, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for participating, and certainly would like to open up for any questions that you all may have. And I'd also like to recognize my associate, Lindy Johnson, who Lindy and I have worked together over the last too many years for us to think about on this rule, working with utilities, working with state regulatory authorities, and yeah, I'll be generous and I'll say working with EPA to help them navigate through some of the nuances of the utility industry. So, Lindy, thank you for your help and support and your collaboration. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either Lindy or myself. So at this point, I see we have a couple questions up there.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Great update. So we do have a number of questions, so let's go ahead and get started. First question is, what steps are needed to qualify for the 2024 retirement subcategory?
For the 2024 retirement subcategory, 2030-44 retirement subcategory, in general, and it applies to several of these waters. First of all, you need to comply with the ELGs as outlined within 2020. So if you're doing the general applicable, you need to meet the FGD wastewater requirements for not only arsenic, mercury, but also selenium and for arsenic and mercury, but selenium and nitrates. And you have to meet those by 2025, the end of 2025, or whatever earlier date your permit writers may have applied. And the same thing for bottom ash. You have to let folks know, and when I say folks, you need to let your regulatory authorities know that you want to do this. So you have to file a notice of planned participation by the end of 25 with your permitting authority. So those are the two major factors that need to be considered.
Thanks, Bill. Is there a way to repurpose any of our biological treatment equipment to meet the ELGs?
Possibly. As we go forward, the ELGs are technology-based limits. I know some folks are using the bioreactors that they've installed for FGD to potentially treat, or they're using them to treat leachate. Now, there's zero discharge does not have a selenium limit in there. And as we look at zero discharge for the various streams, zero discharge is zero discharge. But as we're looking at exceptions to the rule, whether it's the retirement subcategory, you still need to comply to the 25 date. Would it make sense to run your leachate up through there? Are there other streams on site that would make sense? Those are questions that need to be asked. Generally, on the plain vanilla version, there's probably not a whole lot of reason to repurpose those bioreactors unless you have nutrient limits and you're going to continue to discharge. But that's a few years out still. And as I said, the rules are still in flux. We don't know what's going to happen with the, come January 20th of next year and the next round of executive orders. So I would not make any hasty decisions at this point.
All right. Do you expect EPA to correct the inconsistencies between the preamble and the rule? For example, the preamble mentions that CRL permeate can be used for boiler makeup, but the actual rule does not state that.
So whether EPA actually puts out another revision to the rule is to correct some of these inconsistencies, I would say is probably unlikely. What they would probably do is generate an opinion letter or opinion document clarifying that this is what their intent was, uh, and allows the preamble to be used as a basis for further decision making.
Okay, next question in. How is the pressure to retire the coal plants going to impact grid reliability?
Well, yeah, supply chain still hasn't fully recovered from COVID. Um, if we're, I think many of us have heard what the lead times are on transformers. I'm not sure what the situation is on combustion turbines and combined cycle facilities, which are the obvious choices to replace generation, short of going with nuclear. And nuclear has been very challenging, and that permitting process is lengthy. So grid reliability questions are and should be a significant concern. And I would advise folks to share this with your neighbors, your friends, as they're communicating with the politicians, to make sure that we're looking at a comprehensive, holistic energy policy, and not just trying to wipe out coal plants. Uh, it's going to take time. I know the state of South Carolina told utilities in their jurisdiction that they may not retire their coal plants until replacement generation is online. But it takes time for capital to be raised. It takes time for design. It takes time for procurement, and where are the pipelines coming from? Environmental groups have challenged and shut down running additional gas pipelines to fire these natural gas plants. So if there's no gas, what are we going to do? So all good questions.
Thanks, Bill. All right. Why didn't EPA coordinate the dates related to retirement and capital investment between the ELGs, the MATS, and the GHG rules?
Okay, yeah, between the MATS and greenhouse gas rules, um, I think primarily because there were different groups within EPA. All Office of Water is different than the Office of Air. Uh, the I think the ultimate driver politically is to kill coal, uh, and it's imperative that we're reading all these rules and looking at them holistically as we're developing strategy for the plants. Uh, I I think that's an opportunity to challenge EPA once again. Uh, you can retire under the ELGs by 34, but then if you're going to continue with the greenhouse gas rule, there are things you need to do much earlier. That's going to require significant capital investment. Uh, I would say that's an opportunity for challenging the rule based on economically achievable.
I like it, challenging the rule. That's great. Just a friendly reminder for those that do have any questions, please use the Q&A icon at the top of your screen. Happy to address any more of those. We do have one more question that just popped in. Would the standard for the unmanaged CRL category apply to groundwater extracted as part of the implementation of a remedy associated with the CCR rule corrective action requirements? For example, pump and treat where water is discharged through and existing NPDES outfall.
I believe so, because if we're the unmanaged leachate category refers to any sort of groundwater that is then brought to the surface for surface water discharge. And keep in mind that these requirements are anytime you're doing a surface water discharge, NPDES permits apply. And the ELGs have technology-based limits that are just one criteria that the permit writers need to take a look at. The receiving body, the condition of the receiving body, what water quality based limits as opposed to technology based limits all come into play. So based on my understanding of the question, yes, the unmanaged leachate category would apply to your scenario.
Thank you. Can you please speak more to CCR closures needing to comply with legacy wastewater limits by July 8th, 2024? And where's that covered in the ELG rule?
Repeat that one again, please.
Can you please speak more to the CCR closures needing to comply with the legacy wastewater limits by the July 8th, 2024 timeline? Where's that covered in the ELG rule?
I have a clarification on that one, if I can jump in.
Sure.
It has this requirement for July 8th is the if you commence closure by the CCR rule after starting July 8th, then those ELGs apply. So if you're already in progress, it sounds like you don't have to, they may apply those limits by best professional judgment, but it's specific to the closure per the CCR rule by that section of the rule by July 8th, starting July 8th of this year.
Yeah, and EPA was very specific to use the wording that closure has commenced. It's not completed, and it could be a lengthy process, and that's a carrot to those sites that have initiated action or ready, as opposed to waiting as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the 2034 retirement, is there a path to continued operation after 2034 if VLD is adopted? So, or zero liquid discharge?
So following 2034, there is it's zero discharge. So was the question, is there a path for a continued operation with a liquid discharge?
Yes, if ZLD is adopted, so yes.
If ZLD is adopted, then zero liquid discharge is exactly that, zero liquid discharge. And so yes, we can continue to operate past 34. We just can't discharge any waters after that time period for the various waste streams.
Okay, got one more here. For brine management, could you comment on encapsulation with fly ash versus the loss of beneficial reuse of that material?
Sure. Encapsulation involves tying up the various cations and anions in the brines or in the wastewaters, and using CCR materials such as fly ash tends to be much more economical than having to bring Portland cement in or other materials that may be available to generate those pozzolanic reactions. And I know for years, when I started mentioning, or my team was mentioning hey, we're going to need to use some fly ash here on the site, the byproducts folks always got very excited and nervous. Hey, we have contracts to sell all this, but it comes down to a chicken and the egg. Does it make sense to sell something for 25 cents a pound if you have to turn around and buy a replacement material for $1 a pound? And if we're not able to comply with the rules, then by having that zero discharge, being able to tie up those constituents, the potential is that we're not going to operate the plant, and then there won't be any fly ash to sale to start with. I've worked for a utility where some of the sites actually had to ship fly ash into the site to generate their pozzolanic reactions, and that's just not a real comfortable position to be in, having to bring fly ash in. But it was more economical than bringing in high grade lime or Portland cement. So at the end of the day, it comes down to economics. What makes the most sense? If you have contracts you can't get out of, that's why you have attorneys.
All right. And with that, we are going to wrap it up today. Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for your participation. If you have any other questions for Bill, his contact info is in the chat. You will receive an email shortly with a copy of your participation certificate. We will also be posting this presentation on stantec.com if you'd like to listen again or share with a colleague. We hope you can join us again soon. Thank you.